Hello Horror Hounds. A few weeks ago, one of you lovely viewers, thank you Ross, asked me a question in the comment section to one of my videos, and I thought it would be a good sort of talking point, something to open up as a discussion if you're at all interested in jumping on board that. So here is the question he posed. Hi Andrew. I don't know where you stand on this, but I've noticed that over the last few years, an increasing number of what you might call art house films are being marketed as horror movies in a cynical bid to milk as much money out of them as possible. Horror can be notoriously profitable, and it's not as if art house has the same mass appeal.
I bid you welcome.
I welcome you to my house.
Welcome to my house.
Welcome to my home.
Now, a long time ago, I did a video called Is It Horror? And I'll link to it at the end of this video. But this sort of question and subject matter seems to dovetail quite nicely into that video. A lot of the same arguments seem to be cropping up now. Back then I was talking about The Witch and The Babadook. Right now, although I haven't seen it, Jordan Peele's Us is out in cinemas. I saw that he tweeted Us is a horror movie, and an awful lot of people I'm seeing across the social medias are saying that it's not a horror movie, it's a thriller. And I kind of get where Ross is coming from. I think in the question, you'll have to forgive me Ross and correct me down below, there's a lot to unpack from that question, a lot of assumptions that I'm going to have to make. An awful lot of it does seem to circle back round to what is horror. A ton of people on Facebook I've seen, a ton saying, I like Us, it's really effective, it's really tense, but it's a thriller, it's not a horror movie. Now, I'm not suggesting that Us is an art house movie, so it doesn't necessarily go directly to the meat of Ross's question. But laying out my stall right up front, I think one of the things I adore the most about horror as a genre is how much it can infect all other genres. I crazily saw some guy, I wish I could remember the film he was talking about, but I saw him in some horror Facebook group saying that he didn't think that film X, and I wish I could remember what it was, he didn't think it was a horror film. It was about a killer, it was about a guy going around killing people. It was a slasher movie. I definitely remember it was a slasher movie. So I don't consider that a horror movie, it's a thriller, because it doesn't have any supernatural elements to it. And I was thinking, well, okay, fine, everyone's mileage varies, but you're only going to be classifying horror as something that has supernatural elements to it. So, The Passion of the Christ? So I guess for this guy, Psycho is not a horror movie, it's a thriller movie. I remember, and it's still a little stone in my shoe. You can tell I'm still annoyed by this decades later. When Silence of the Lambs won a clutch of Oscars, all of a sudden it was a psychological thriller. No one will say that a successful horror movie is a horror movie, because horror movies don't get awards. There's a natural tension in Ross's question between profitability, saleability, commercial aspect of filmmaking, and the art house, the credible sort of award-winning, critically acclaimed. There's generally in movie making, it's fair to say, a tension between critically acclaimed and commercial, which is why I think the Academy waited to find out whether Return of the King was going to be a decent movie before giving any nods to Peter Jackson and their enormous crew for the huge coup they pulled off, filming 3 blockbuster movies back to back. We better wait and see if all of them are good, and then we'll give him some awards for the overall achievement. We'll sit on our hands on this one. And critics, some, not all of them, but some of them can be a bit like this, and academies and award givers can be a little bit like this. So if there's a sniff or a hint that anything's a horror movie, bar visual effects or perhaps music. They won't take away any of the big awards. So, the presumption in the question is that there are some art house movies using the horror tag to get wider commercial availability, to get people to sit up and notice and go to see an art house movie where they wouldn't normally, whilst at the same time we know that commercial horror movies, whilst they can take in all the bucks in the world, Halloween 2018 recently did great business, won't be getting any awards. Jamie Lee Curtis, despite thoroughly deserving it, won't be getting any nods for her turn in Halloween 2018. That's not to say that I think Halloween 2018 is a great film, but that's another story. Ross, I should have asked you what films you were talking about. Which art house films are marketing themselves as horror movies in a cynical bid, as you put it, to milk as much money out of them as possible. Hereditary is an out-and-out horror movie. There's no question. By the time, I can't imagine that you're meaning that. By the time you get to the third act, there's absolutely no question that that's a horror movie. Mandy, very much an art house movie, paddles in the sea of horror, but also gives a very much down-to-earth explanation of all the Cenobite type things that are going on. If you want to go with that and you're more comfortable it not being a horror movie, then you can. It sort of gives those viewers an out. Suspiria, I guess you might be thinking of. I mean, that's going to be such a weird one to... Is Suspiria a horror movie? It's clearly a remake of a horror movie. It's got some horror elements to it, but you could go back to the original and perhaps argue that isn't that the movie, the original Suspiria, where Argento sort of stretches his wings even more and pushes or drags the horror movie as it was then into the art house realm. Dario Argento's original Suspiria is clearly a horror movie, but it wasn't just the same old giallo that everyone was expecting him to make. He was bringing something new to the table. He was expanding his own art form and creating something that he hadn't created before. And so is the original Suspiria an art house movie? It's clearly a horror movie. One of the things I love about the horror genre, as I mentioned earlier, is that it can infect all other genres. You can have movies that are straight up and down, clearly horror movies. So, The Evil Dead. And then you can have movies that are straight up and down horror that are also, I'm thinking something like The Exorcist, which is also really high end and is just so phenomenally good that committees like the Academy just cannot freaking ignore it. I mean, those breakthroughs are so few and far between. And we talk about golden ages of horror coming round, and so when The Exorcist got all its nods, when Silence of the Lambs got all its nods, when Get Out got all its nods, every time you see certain groups of horror fans thinking, well, this is now the period where my genre gets recognised, where we get to come in from the cold, but we don't want to come in from the cold because we're the outsiders, we're the punk rockers. We're the outliers, the odd, the weird ones who sit in the shadows. We are Wednesday Addams. And if we became the mainstream, sometimes it sits a little uncomfortably with us, doesn't it? And for all that we can go and at the moment see Halloween 2018 or It and the big, all the Conjuring movie stuff that Conjuring cinematic universe with all this gloss and hype and marketing campaigns behind it. Isn't it sometimes nice to just watch something that's really down and dirty? And what we're waiting for, the next sea change, is not usually some big movie studio thing. It's something really grungy and really punk, like Texas Chainsaw Massacre, like Night of the Living Dead. To a certain extent, like Psycho, because although yes, that was a prestige director, it was black and white, small budget. It was at the time people were really saying, why is Hitchcock making this scummy, scuzzy little movie? Now we can see, as I've argued in my Psycho video, that Psycho is the stepping stone between the universal horror monsters and our modern age monsters of the mind, serial killer fixation. But at the time, no, it was just a dirty, nasty little movie. But horror can be sci-fi. Alien, Event Horizon, could quite easily classify those as sci-fi movies, but no one's really going to argue that they're not horror movies as well. Horror can infect family drama, it can infect action movies, it can infect comedy. It can be, horror can be anything, and I really can't think of, maybe comedy is the only other genre that can be everything else as well. So, in answer to your question, I'm not particularly fazed by it. If the horror genre can generate a few more bucks for these independent art housey movies that need to make a splash. Every new movie made now really badly needs to make a splash. And if making your art house movie informed by horror is a way to break through all the noise and get it noticed in festivals and stuff like that, I'm glad horror can help. If at the same time it can get noticed, get critical notices, things like The Babadook, The Witch, Mandy, and at the same time, whilst the horror genre is maybe pulling your box office up, you're pulling some of our cred up as well as horror lovers. You know, we're not just knuckle dragging idiots. We all know this, but we all know what the perception outside of our genre is. And the more occasions people can go, well, that's a really thoughtful, well-made horror movie. Maybe the more times that happens, the less surprised each time someone will be when they say that. I don't normally watch horror movies, but I mean, The Shining. Is that an art house movie? It kind of is. Is it a horror movie? Absolutely, it's a horror movie. And now Stanley Kubrick, for all that the man was a sort of auteur genius filmmaker, do you want to know what really frustrated him? Steven Spielberg's populism. He wanted the kind of commercial, he wanted to reach a wide audience. And he dabbled in horror for that very reason. He wanted a hit. And he saw that horror was fashionable, so he made a horror movie. He just happened to make a Stanley Kubrick horror movie. Would we be without The Shining? I don't want to be without The Shining, but make no mistake, Stanley Kubrick's reasons behind making that movie were cynical and they were commercial. And why not? He's in the business of the filmmaking business. He's in the business to try and make money. He was looking at Steven Spielberg and he was seeing the receipts for Close Encounters of the Third Kind and Jaws and all of that kind of stuff. This is why he talked to him about AI. They weren't going to make AI together, that was never the intention, but he had intended AI to be a Spielbergian type commercial hit. It would have just ended up being another Stanley Kubrick movie, and it would have taken audiences 10 years to warm up to it and then go, do you know what, this is a work of absolute genius, which is kind of what happened when Spielberg took over the reins. It took about a decade for people to go, actually, do you know what, this is really good. So, long story short, it doesn't vex me that much. I come from a period where Paramount, I'm going to get another gripe off me. Paramount were becoming palpably embarrassed by the success of the Friday the 13th franchise and really clearly wanted to kill it dead. But it kept making money, so they kept making sequels, but they kept pulling the budget down and down and down and down. And eventually, they killed the goose that was laying the golden eggs for them out of embarrassment, because they wanted to be a prestige company. They did the same with Star Trek, and they reduced the budgets of Star Trek less and less and less and less, but kept making them because the films kept making money. And you could tell that they were palpably embarrassed by it, and that really, really got my goat. So the only real conclusion I can come to is in the form of a question. And that question is, David Lynch, the man makes art house movies, no question. Unless you can correct me, he doesn't specify what genre they're in. They're David Lynch movies. But the horror community has clearly, for a long time, embraced Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me as a horror movie. Inland Empire has some fucking freaky moments in it, as does Lost Highway. Lost Highway has one of the scariest moments in any movie I've ever seen, and it's just two guys talking at a dinner party. So I wouldn't bat an eyelid if people say that David Lynch makes horror movies. He doesn't always make horror movies, but no one calls David Lynch a horror director. Least of all, David Lynch himself doesn't argue that it doesn't try and use the horror tag to try and sell his movies. He's a kind of little cottage industry in and of himself. He releases David Lynch movies. But I wouldn't be without Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me, one of the hands down scariest movies I've ever seen. I wouldn't be without The Shining. I wouldn't be without The Exorcist. I wouldn't be without Mandy, The Witch, The Babadook. An awful lot of these divisive, it's not really a horror movie type films are the ones that I've ended up really digging. Whereas the big, clearly horror movies like Halloween 2018 have left me kind of cold. Sorry, I know it's got a lot of fans. That said, there is a sense right now that horror is big business. And it is perhaps right to suggest that the big studios are bandwagon jumping, because they always chase a buck. So we have a glut of horror at the moment. We have probably more horror on TV and on our streaming services than we have ever had at any point ever. So I would maybe twist the question and suggest that rather than art house movies using the horror tag to try and boost their profits, same as they've always done, the big studios are seeing a bit of a horror renaissance at the moment, and they're the ones jumping on. And if anything, as with all things, they will be the ones that ultimately stifle it and snuff it out. Then horror's going to go underground for a little bit, and we'll be scrabbling around, and there'll be some diamonds in the rough and gems. And trust me, we will be grateful for those little indie movies and those little art house movies. Bottom line, if it's good, it's good. If it's trash, it's trash. Quality will always float to the top. Time will always tell. And if there's something out there that you love, vaya con Dios, love it, my friend. If it's not for you, leave it be. That's the best I got. What do you guys think? Does Ross have a point? Does it get on your nerves as well? Do you have a very specific definition of what horror is to you? And please, no one below the line say people are right or people are wrong. I know that I have a very, very broad definition of horror. Mine is a very broad church when it comes to horror, but I know that there are other people who are very specific about what they consider horror, what they consider thrillers and the like. It's all good, but please let me know what you think. Is my finger on the pulse? Or is it, to quote Kevin Smith, way off the pulse, here jammed up my ass?